If you think monsters only walk at night, this case will teach you otherwise. January 1984, along Colorado's Front Range. Bitter air, thin light. Suburbs where cul-de-sacs curl like commas, and garage doors lift to reveal the day's ordinary rituals. Morning coffee, kids' backpacks, a car warming up before work. It should have been that kind of month. Instead, it became a calendar the region would try not to remember and never be able to forget. 6 days before the name Bennett hit the news, another name did. Patricia Louise Smith, a 50-year-old interior designer living in Lakewood. Midday, in her own home, someone beat her to death with a hammer and sexually assaulted her. There were no neighbors who could make sense of the silence that followed. No simple explanation to carry the weight. Police collected what they could. The geometry of a struggle, the imprint of a weapon, the traces a killer can't help but leave, and swore they would not forget. That promise would matter later. Then came January 15th to 16th, Aurora. In a modest house on East Center Drive, the Bennetts were settling into a new year and a new routine. Bruce, 27, worked with his hands and thought about the future like a builder, one measured cut at a time. Deborah, 26, kept the home humming. Birthdays on the calendar, laundry that never had the chance to stack up, the rhythm of a young family finding its center. Melissa, 7, had that grade school energy that turns any hallway into a race course. And Vanessa, just 3 years old, had the kind of laugh that makes adults drop whatever they're doing because the sound seems too pure to waste. Sometime after dark that Sunday, and before the morning broke on Monday, an intruder crossed the line between outside and in. What happened in that house is known in the way investigators know, carefully, clinically, because that is how you hold the worst truths without letting them take everything. A hammer was used as the primary weapon. There was sexual violence. There were wounds so vicious that even seasoned detectives would later struggle to describe them without pausing for breath. The next morning, the day refused to start the way it was supposed to. Bruce didn't make it to work. Deborah didn't either. Phones rang, then rang again. Finally, a mother did what mothers do when worry becomes a shape you can see. Connie Bennett drove over to check on her family. She walked into a scene that still makes her voice change when she talks about it. Her son dead near the kitchen, her daughter-in-law and granddaughter slain, her youngest granddaughter grievously injured but clinging to life. Connie's call to police pulled the city into a story it would carry for the next 4 decades. Let's place the names with care because that is the only decent way to begin. Bruce Bennett, Deborah Bennett, Melissa Bennett, killed in their home. Vanessa Bennett, 3 years old, left with devastating injuries and a future that would demand a kind of courage most of us will never be asked to find. The first hours after a crime are all urgency and restraint. Uniformed officers secured the home, turned chaos into lanes. Crime scene techs began their slow work, photographing every room, marking every stain, collecting every fiber and hair and latent print that might one day speak. The hammer had a message. The pattern of blows had another. The presence of sexual assault told a third. Each detail mattered. None of it, alone, could explain the cruelty. Detectives widened the circle. Who had reason? Who had opportunity? What did the neighborhood cameras see, if any? What footprints were outside? And what did the weather do to them overnight? In 1984, the toolbox didn't include the version of DNA science we take for granted now. Still, the best teams were already thinking like the future. Preserve, preserve, preserve. Bag what you can't yet interpret. Label what you can't yet decode. One day, chemistry will catch up. Across town, investigators kept returning to Patricia Smith's living room. The earlier scene with the same terrible signature. A hammer, a sexual assault, a home violated in the midday quiet. The two crimes were separated by miles and by less than a week, but they rhymed in all the wrong ways. The comparison wasn't speech, it was instinct. The way experienced detectives feel a pattern before they can prove one. Still, feeling isn't proof. The cases would remain formally separate for years, while the science the killers of that era didn't believe in came into its own. While the evidence waited in cold storage for a future it could use, Vanessa fought for her life in the here and now. Surgeons repaired what they could. Nurses bent the rules of detachment as nurses do when a child is on the line. Family kept vigil in waiting rooms that absorb as much prayer as fluorescent light. And an entire city learned how to hold its breath. There's an easy way to tell a story like this. Turn the killer into the star. We won't do that. This first chapter belongs to the people in the house and to a timeline that refuses to let the violence stand alone. Before any suspect had a face or a name, the investigation built a scaffold of facts sturdy enough to hold the weight of years. Those facts begin with a window of time. Sometime between the late hours of January 15th and late morning January 16th, the Bennett's home transformed from sanctuary to crime scene. They include the weapon, a hammer, wielded with a kind of rage that tells you something about the person before you ever lay eyes on him. They include sexual assaults that turn a break-in into atrocity. They include the position of bodies, the direction of blood, the shape of wounds. All those quiet details that speak loudest to people trained to listen. They also include the thing every detective hates most, the sudden stop. Leads that heated the phone lines for a week went cool. Tips took investigators everywhere, which is not the same as somewhere. Weeks became months. Months hardened into years. The Bennett file got thicker, then yellowed at the edges, but it never left the active shelf in the minds of those who had walked that house and sworn to the dead that they would keep coming back to the work until the work looked back. All the while, Vanessa grew up. Childhood became adolescence, became adulthood. She carried scars you can see and others you cannot. She built a life anyway. She learned what thousands of survivors learn. The past can be the engine that drags you, or the one you harness. Some days it is both. And the science kept moving. Laboratories got better at wringing identity from molecules. Cold case units across the country began revisiting evidence once considered mute. In Colorado, the items preserved from those January rooms, the Lakewood living room, the Aurora hallway, were ready when the technology finally was. Profiles were generated. Cross-checks were run. Computers did the grinding work so detectives could do the human kind. A shape began to appear where, for decades, there had only been shadow. That part of the story is for later chapters. For now, the only honest place to pause is here. With a grandmother's discovery, a city's heartbreak, and a promise preserved in envelopes and evidence lockers that the future would be given its chance to speak. Cold cases don't sleep, they wait. In this one, the evidence waited more than 3 decades for a science that didn't exist the night the Bennetts died. Start with the boxes. Carefully labeled, sealed, and shelved, they carried the worst moments from 2 homes. A Lakewood living room where a 50-year-old woman, Patricia Louise Smith, was beaten to death with a hammer, and an Aurora split level where a young family was destroyed in the dark hours between Sunday and Monday. Those boxes held fibers and hairs and swabs and photographs, each a hieroglyph that couldn't be translated yet. Detectives came and went, generations of them, each repeating the same vow: preserve everything. One day we'll have new tools. The first whisper that the future had arrived came years before anyone had a name. In the early 2000s, material from the Bennett scene was typed and uploaded to a national database. A few years later, technicians were able to generate a profile from the Patricia Smith evidence. When the two were compared, the result made investigators sit up. The same genetic signature touched both crimes. The cases that detectives had long felt belonged together finally spoke the same language. The Hammer Killer wasn't folklore, he was one man. But a profile isn't a person, it's a shadow with edges. You still need a match, something you can write under a mugshot. That part would come, improbably, from another state's prison yard. In the summer of 2018, Nevada authorities swabbed an inmate as part of a law that allowed the collection of DNA from people already behind bars. The sample flowed through the same national pipeline Colorado had used for years. And then, one ordinary day, a computer returned a result that wasn't ordinary at all. A direct hit. The name attached to the cheek swab was Alex Christopher Ewing. The profile attached to the Colorado crimes was the same. The announcement broke the kind of silence only long grief can make. Detectives who had guarded this case like a candle in a windstorm finally said it out loud. A man serving time in Nevada for a brutal, unrelated attack was now accused of killing Patricia Smith in Lakewood, and Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa Bennett in Aurora, and of nearly killing 3-year-old Vanessa. The Hammer Killer wasn't a myth. He was a living inmate with a DOC number. If that's where the story ended, it would feel like a screenwriter cheated, an answer popping out of a machine to solve what human beings couldn't. But the truth was more complicated and, in its way, more human. To understand how Ewing landed in a Nevada cell in the first place, rewind to the same year as the Colorado murders. In the summer of 1984, months after the hammer attacks along Colorado's Front Range, a late-night assault in Henderson, Nevada left a couple beaten with a wooden pickaxe handle. The attacker was arrested, and while being transported months later for a court hearing, escaped custody during a bathroom stop. He ran. He changed clothes. That night, he broke into another home and attacked again. Police caught him soon after. His convictions in Nevada sent him to prison on a long sentence that had nothing to do with Colorado. And for decades, no one in the public knew the lines between those files would one day intersect. Back in Colorado, the DNA hit in 2018 didn't end the work. It began a new phase. Prosecutors in both Arapahoe County and Jefferson County filed charges. Paper moved like weather systems. Complaints, warrants, affidavits, outlining what could finally be said plainly. That the same genetic profile recovered from the Lakewood and Aurora scenes matched the man in a Nevada cell. Ewing fought extradition. Lawyers argued across state lines. Courts considered the law and the facts. Finally, in early 2020, he was transferred to Colorado to stand trial on charges that had waited most of a lifetime. Inside those filings was the clinical detail that gives a case its bones. The Bennett counts charged first-degree murder after deliberation and felony murder, sexual assault, burglary, crimes of violence, and attempts associated with Vanessa's survival. The Patricia Smith case charged first-degree murder and felony murder tied to sexual assault and burglary. The language was spare because it had to be. The violence itself needed no adjectives. For the families, the news was both anchor and storm. Connie Bennett, who had found her son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter all those years before, sat in court and listened as lawyers spoke her family's names without trembling. Vanessa, whose life began again in an ICU in 1984, watched the system turn toward the man the evidence said had tried to erase her future. People sometimes imagine this moment feels like triumph. Survivors will tell you it feels like standing in wind. Bracing, loud, relentless, necessary. Meanwhile, the public finally heard a fuller version of the January timeline, including attacks that framed the spree. In the dozen days around the two murders, a series of assaults in the metro Denver area, one on a couple, one on a woman who survived, marked a path of escalating brutality. At the time, investigators weren't certain a single hand gripped the weapons in all of them. By 2018, DNA began to draw those lines with a thicker pen. The narrative that had always felt probable, one man moving through homes, improvising the worst, gained the weight of science. The extradition, slow-rolled by appeals and a pandemic, ended with Ewing in a Colorado courtroom facing two separate trials. Prosecutors made a simple strategic choice. Try the Bennett case first in Arapahoe County, then the Patricia Smith case in Jefferson County. That sequencing would let a jury hear the Bennett evidence cleanly, with its own witnesses and forensic map before the second panel took up the Lakewood murder with its matching signature. Each case would stand on its own. Together, they would describe a single winter of terror. As those court dates approached, something else shifted. The way the public talked about what DNA can and can't do. This was not a case of distant relatives and family trees. It was classic forensic DNA, crime scene material preserved in the 1980s meeting a known, direct profile collected from a living person. The match was as straightforward as this science gets. People who had once muttered about coincidence stopped muttering when they saw the paper trail laid side by side. Sample to profile, profile to database, database to name, name to charges. The strongest stories in court are the ones that don't lean on adjectives. The Bennett file had those stories. So did the Patricia Smith file. A lab analyst testifies showing the chain of custody from a swab in 1984 to a report in the 20-teens. A detective describes the moment the system pinged with a name and how he called a colleague, and both men went quiet, because quiet was the only safe reaction. A mother recounts the morning that divided her life into before and after. A survivor, grown now, uses a voice that carries the weight of what her 3-year-old body endured and the will she built to carry it. By the time the first jury would be impaneled, this much was finally clear. The line from January 1984 now had a face on it. The hammer killer no longer existed as a phrase you use to organize fear. He existed as a defendant the state had to prove guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In a system built on caution and proof, that shift from legend to legal case is everything. Courtrooms don't feel like places where winter ends, but that's what they became in Colorado, when a box of old evidence finally learned a new language. Once the DNA said the quiet part out loud, the hammer killer stopped being an outline and stepped into fluorescent light with a name: Alex Christopher Ewing. The first trial landed where the Bennett file had lived all along, Arapahoe County. Summer 2021, nearly 38 years after Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa were killed, and Vanessa was left clinging to life. The jurors who showed up carried none of that history with them, and that was the point. Trials start over. They don't inherit outrage, they rebuild proof. Openings were spare. Prosecutors didn't ask the jury to feel anything. They asked them to see. They laid the sequence down like track. A January night in Aurora, a house turned inside out, blunt force injuries that told their own terrible story, sexual assaults that turned a burglary into atrocity, preserved swabs that slept for decades and then woke, a name that arrived not from a confession but from a database, and the defendant's known history in another state that explained how a Colorado ghost could have been living under Nevada's sky. The defense called the science simple only if you ignored contamination risks, chain of custody gaps, and the absence of fingerprints or weapon DNA that spelled one man and only one man. They asked for skepticism. That too was the point. Skepticism is what juries are for. There was nothing cinematic about the proof. A lab analyst held up paper that had more signatures than a mortgage and walked the chain from 1984 to 2018 to the defendant's cheek swab. Cold case detectives testified to the moment a computer pinged with a match and the way the room went quiet when the name landed. A medical examiner stood where grief can't live and described, level-voiced, what hammers do to bone, and what those specific blows said about anger and intent. A surviving neighbor outlined a sliver of timeline. A mother, Connie Bennett, filled the room with the weight of the morning that split her life into before and after. Then came Vanessa, not the toddler in an ICU bed this time, but a grown woman, whose body carries the record of that night. She told a story that no 3-year-old could tell in 1984, but that her scars have been telling ever since. Juries don't convict out of sympathy, but they are allowed to understand scale. The defense pressed where they could. No weapon recovered, no tape labeled "this is the killer's," no eyewitness who could point and say him. They floated alternatives the way defense teams have to. Unknown assailants, untested hypotheses, the messiness of a crime scene older than some jurors. Prosecutors stayed on the rails. They reminded the jury that the law doesn't require every shadow to have a name. It requires the state to prove the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The DNA was not a hint. It was an anchor. Everything else, the injuries, the pattern, the preserved material, the spree that January across Metro Denver tightened the rope. On an August afternoon in 2021, the jury came back. The words arrived like a metronome. Guilty on all counts for the murders of Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa. Guilty for the attacks that nearly killed Vanessa. Guilty for the burglaries and sexual assaults that turned a family home into a battlefield. You could feel the calendar buckle under the verdict, an entire region letting out the breath it had been holding since Ronald Reagan was president and the Front Range was a different place. Sentencing in the Bennett case followed days later. The judge spoke first to the facts. 3 lives taken, 1 spared but forever changed. A weapon chosen for what it does to faces and futures. Then he spoke to scale. Over a span of roughly 12 days in January 1984, the person at the defense table had inflicted what he called an unspeakable orgy of violence. The law from that era set the terms. Life with the possibility of parole after 20 years on each murder count. Not because the system was soft, but because that's what the statute book said in 1984. The judge stacked those 3 life sentences consecutively, then added time for the related crimes. Paper can't balance what happened in the Bennett's house, but it can refuse to pretend these were single acts. 1 county over, another winter waited its turn. The case of Patricia Louise Smith, the Lakewood murder less than a week before the Bennetts, had always felt like the opening chapter of the same story. The DNA said it was. In April 2022, in Jefferson County, a new jury sat under new fluorescent lights and heard a trial that echoed and stood alone at the same time. The room learned who Patricia was, a 50-year-old mother and interior designer, killed in her home in the midday quiet by someone who brought a hammer and a cruelty that outlived him by decades. They learned what the science had preserved from her living room and how that profile lined up with the one from Aurora, and how both lined up with a Nevada inmate's cheek. The defense ran the same routes. No fingerprints tying, hands to handle, no admission you could play back in open court, no video of the door opening. The prosecution returned to the map. Same month, same metro area, same signature, same DNA. The jury needed less time than a full day's work to agree. Guilty, first-degree murder in multiple forms, including felony murder counts tied to sexual assault and robbery. 5 days later, the sentence in Patricia's case was read into the record. Life under the law, in effect at the time. Again, with parole eligibility that exists on paper more than it does in reality for a man already carrying consecutive lives next door. Trials don't give back what they're for. They do something else. They put the public truth in a place where it can be lifted without tearing. When the last juror was thanked and the last exhibit reboxed, Colorado's longest, coldest winter finally had a date stamp. 1984. No longer floated unmoored. It was fixed to a name the law could speak and a sentence the system could enforce. There were quieter reckonings, too. Investigators who had guarded these files through retirements and funerals let themselves use words like relief. Families who had learned to live in the unending present of a cold case stepped into a new, awkward tense after the verdict. For Vanessa, adulthood finally included a courtroom where the man the evidence named was made to sit and listen. For the Smith family, truth settled the way it should, on the record, not in rumor. In the defense's closing at the Bennett trial, they warned the jury against a simple story. They were right about one thing. Nothing about this was simple. It was painstaking. It was careful. It was proof stacked on proof until it could carry almost 40 years of waiting. After the last gavel, the courthouse steps went quiet the way mountains do after a storm. Not because nothing happened, but because everything did. The hammer killer finally had a name the law could say, sentences the law could enforce, and two juries that closed a chapter too heavy for one set of shoulders. But justice in a case like this doesn't look like a parade. It looks like people learning new ways to carry old weight. Start with the families. Connie Bennett spent almost 4 decades practicing the language of patience so thoroughly it became muscle memory. Verdict day didn't erase the morning she opened the door to her son's home. It gave that morning a border. Boundaries matter. They keep the past from spilling over everything every day. Connie could place fresh flowers without also placing fresh questions. She could tell stories about Bruce as the dad he was becoming, about Deborah as the steady center of a young home, about Melissa with her 7-year-old charge toward tomorrow. And she could do it without having to add, "We still don't know." Knowing is a kind of shelter. For Vanessa, adulthood now included a courtroom where the person the evidence named had to sit still and listen. That's not closure. Closure is a word people use when they want grief to behave. But it is completion. She grew up with scars that introduced themselves before memories did, and she built a life anyway. That's the part people forget to name. Survival isn't just the day you live. It's the years you keep choosing to. Her voice in court didn't ask for pity. It offered proof of endurance, of possibility, of the truth that surviving and thriving are complicated sisters who sometimes take turns. Across the metro area, another family folded a verdict into their ritual. The Smiths had spent a generation with Patricia's living room sealed in photographs and evidence bags. When a jury said guilty, it pinned the date to more than a calendar. It pinned it to accountability. You can feel the difference at a graveside. Names sound different when the state has finished its sentence. What about the cops and scientists, the ones who became guardians of envelopes and slides? Their celebration looked like work. They stood at podiums and thanked colleagues, and then went back to their benches and desks. Because the lesson of this case is humbling. Store it right, label it clean, fight for the budget, and wait without letting up. If the future is going to help, it needs you to give it something to grab. Communities mark survival by how quickly the ordinary returns, and by which parts of the ordinary they change on purpose. In Colorado, cold case stopped sounding like an epitaph and more like a promise. District attorneys pointed to shelves and said, "Those aren't dusty, they're staged." Lab directors asked for better freezers, better robots, better training. Patrol officers learned to look at living rooms as future archives. Don't rush the bag, don't smudge the print, don't shortcut the chain. The science in this story didn't arrive as magic. It arrived as habit. There is a harder conversation this case forced into daylight: sentencing across eras. The murders happened under 1984 law, which did not yet carry the modern guarantees of life without parole for crimes like these. So the judge stacked consecutive life terms and added decades where he could. On paper, parole eligibility exists as a technicality tied to the statute book of that time. In reality, stacked lives in multiple counties function like a locked door with no handle. Even so, families had to sit through a math lesson that felt cruel on its face. How do you translate 3 stolen lives and a fourth nearly taken into numbers that never add up? The answer is you don't. You write the numbers anyway. So the public truth has a place to live. Another lesson is older than DNA. Monsters do daylight too. Patricia Smith died in the middle of a weekday. The Bennetts were attacked in the hour when most of us are making lunches for the next morning. Evil does not obey curfew. The answer isn't fear, it's attention. Neighborhoods rediscovered small courtesies that double as safety. Know your neighbor's rhythms without policing their lives. Check on the house that goes quiet when it shouldn't. Decide as a block that porch lights and unlocked chains of care are part of the HOA. You don't need someone to write. For those who prefer stories with clean motives, this one refuses to participate. Trials require proof of acts, not perfect explanations of why. Rage, opportunism, impulse, escalation. The words available don't stitch themselves into a single satisfying sentence, and maybe that's honest. Some harm is exactly what it looks like. A person choosing to be a storm where people were asleep. There were graces too, the small ones that make the human ledger legible. Detectives who retired kept answering their phones. Reporters who'd covered the case as rookies came back with the muscle to write about aftermath without reopening wounds. A courtroom learned the discipline of quiet while a survivor found the discipline of speech. Even the calendar learned a new trick. January stopped being a season of waiting and became a season of remembering. What remains? Names. That's the simplest and hardest part. Say them in the order that feels like a family photo. Patricia Louise Smith, 50. Interior designer, mother. A woman whose daytime hours belonged to clients and whose evenings belonged to the people she fed and loved. The living room that held her last hour holds something else now. The proof that persistence is its own kind of justice. Bruce Bennett, 27. The father whose hands built things and whose future was a to-do list of good intentions becoming good work. Deborah Bennett, 26. The organizer of small joys. The voice that turns a house into a home. Melissa Bennett, 7. The sprinting laughter. The backpack by the door. The science project that would have been messy and wonderful. And Vanessa Bennett, 3 then. A grown woman now. Proof that one terrible night does not hold the copyright on a life. Say them again, not as an epilogue, but as a practice. This story is not about a nickname. It isn't about a weapon with tabloid gravity. It's about people who were living and then weren't. And then a region that refused to file them under mystery. It's about envelopes kept clean long enough for the future to arrive. It's about the long choreography of care. Investigators, nurses, lab techs, prosecutors, clerks, jurors, and families who never stopped showing up. If you need a final image to carry out of this series, skip the courtroom and the chain link and the mugshot. Picture instead a shelf in an evidence room. Neat handwritten labels facing out. The cold, humming, steady. Picture a technician opening a box, like a librarian opens a rare book. Picture a detective standing a step back, hands behind his back so he won't touch what time is about to speak through. That's what solved this. Not legend, not luck, care. If you want true cases told without sensationalism, with the victims at the center, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next episode. In the comments, honor their names: Patricia Louise Smith, Bruce Bennett, Deborah Bennett, Melissa Bennett, and survivor Vanessa Bennett. Share responsibly. Your support helps us continue careful, respectful storytelling.